Hey, Tina.
Yes, Leah.
A few months ago, I was talking with a patient, like a new consult, and I asked them at the end, like I always do you have any questions? And they asked me, is dairy bad for cancer? And I said, there's really no strong evidence showing one way or the other. And I kind of had this conversation. And the very next day, I got an article in my inbox that said that dairy increases the risk of breast cancer.
Oh, no.
And I'm like, what the heck? What the heck? And so, yeah, that kind of like reminded me of those first episodes that we did on soy and alcohol. Like what the heck? Like, how can you have one day there's an article saying, no, dairy's fine. And then the next, dairy's going to kill you. Like, what's the truth?
What is the truth? The truth about dairy.
That's what we're talking about today, huh?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I'll spare you my philosophical musings of late, but this speaks to the idea that medicine is not a hard science. We don't get to do the black and white that hard sciences get to do, right? I mean, gravity exists, and there's equations to show that. We're what I would call more of a soft science in medicine, which means you can't just replicate the same thing over and over. Every person with breast cancer, dairy is bad for, or every person with prostate cancer, dairy is bad for, or is good for, because people are different. So it precludes the scientific model to a large extent.
You can't, yeah, I don't think that you can go back into somebody's like diet history and like pinpoint exactly like, oh, it was this one time you had that extra cheese on the pizza. That's what got you. It just, and diet, or nutrition, I should say, it's such a touchy subject because I think people do blame themselves for, oh, it's because of how I ate
Mm-hmm.
or whatever reason. And, nobody should put that blame on themselves. But it is something that is often showing up in articles. And when I say articles, I mean like this is like Medscape stuff. This isn't like, I don't know. Like this isn't Cosmo or USA Today.
Good housekeeping?
Good housekeeping. Yeah, no, this is, these are like medical newsletters that I'm getting. But it's constantly like dairy is protective, dairy is harmful.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just going to kind of investigate that on this episode.
Yeah, so let's deconstruct dairy. I'm Dr. Tina Kaiser, and as Leah likes to say, I'm the sciencey one.
And I'm Dr. Leah Sherman, and I'm the Cancer Insider.
And we're two naturopathic doctors who practice integrative cancer care.
But we're not your doctors.
This is for education, entertainment, and informational purposes only.
Do not apply any of this information without first speaking to your doctor.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast by the hosts and their guests are solely their own.
Welcome to the Cancer Pod. So in my research, in my investigative reporting into the truth about dairy, I came upon the coolest article, which I know you haven't had a chance to read yet, but it's called Why Humans Have Evolved to Drink Milk, because that has often been my question. Like, why do we drink the milk of another animal?
Mm-hmm.
I just think that's weird.
Well, it is.
It's very weird. But it's kind of cool because we've only been drinking milk for like within the past 10,000 years. And it kind of started with those like the farmers and the, what do you call them? I guess shepherds or, people minding the pastures. They're the who kind of started it because they started domesticating animals. And there was something that pointed out that cows are really docile. I think there was another article that was like, why do we drink cow milk more than like goat or other animals? And it's because cows are really docile. And they also produce large quantities of milk. Whereas goats, you have to, you don't get as much. Sheep, you really don't get a lot. Apparently reindeer are really hard to hold down, to keep tame. People do drink reindeer milk. But yeah, no, it was very, very interesting to kind of learn the history behind why in the first place we started drinking milk. And if you think about it, if you're living somewhere and maybe the water isn't good, or maybe there isn't a lot of water, you can get fluid, you can get nutrition from the milk of another animal.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there is a survival element, especially because milk does have a lot of protein and a lot of calories.
I was at this conference. I'm in the back row because that's where I always sit. But I was sitting next to this woman. She was well into her 80s. She's a professor at some university down in Texas, and she's a nutritionist all of her life, or dietitian all of her life. They were talking about dairy, and I remember her looking at me and saying, well, dairy is the one food that is a complete food all around. People could survive on dairy. Like if you could survive on dairy if you could tolerate it, of course. I mean, lactose intolerance people cannot survive on it, but assuming you can digest it. But she said as far as composition goes, it's one of the few things that's complete. It's complete protein, it's complete in fats, it's complete in carbohydrates. And I just looked at her like, it's never occurred to me to think of dairy that way. So I just thought this was interesting because she's gone through so many different phases of, milk being good for you. It does a body good.
Oh, right. That was good marketing.
That was really good marketing.
So you kind of brought up like not everyone can tolerate, dairy products. Some people can tolerate like yogurt and cheese, but not necessarily drinking milk itself. And yeah, that has to do with lactase, which is the reason why certain populations can tolerate dairy products better than others is because of evolution and what they call lactase persistence, which I thought was kind of cool.
Lactase persistence, meaning that the enzyme in the gut that breaks up lactose is handed down generation to generation.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. Okay.
And there was something in that article from the BBC that talked about how in Mongolia, what do they drink? I think it's yak milk, maybe, but they drink it fermented.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would make it more tolerated because the article actually did say, like, for the people in Western Europe who first started drinking milk, they probably farted a lot because it wasn't until, the people who had more lactase, because lactase is that enzyme that breaks down the lactose in the milk. Babies have a lot of that. And then as you grow older, it decreases. And then think about cancer treatments and the effect they have on the GI system. And so, I mean, how many patients have said to you, oh, I used to tolerate milk and now I can't because of those enzymes are no longer hanging out doing their job.
Yeah. So, and I want to interject here that enzymes, I think a lot of people in our world, my patients I know, have always, when they hear the word enzymes, they think pancreas. They think of pancreatic enzymes. But there's a whole host of enzymes that are made by your small intestine. It's called the brush border. And lactase is one of those enzymes. It's made by the brush border cells along your small intestine. And so that area, as you just said, gets damaged by chemotherapy because it's rapidly dividing cells along that area. And the chemo is indiscriminate about killing rapidly dividing cells. And so what results is you lose the ability to make lactase. Sometimes this is short-lived, right? There's a transient loss. But sometimes when you lose the ability to make lactase, you also lose the ability to make other brush border enzymes. And those might be enzymes involved in digesting broccoli or beans, those classic gassy foods. But lactase is our topic today. So I want to put that out there because I think it helps people to understand that the chemo damaged your gut and that it can come back over time. You just have to treat it well.
And then surgeries and radiation also, if it's to that area, it's going to have more of a permanent effect. And so I think, touching on this whole like lactose intolerance, we want to make sure people don't confuse that with a dairy allergy or sensitivity.
Yeah.
That's completely different. That's not, you can't just pop some Lactaid and you're all good.
Yes. And so just to put a cap on this lactase and lactose intolerance, lactase is the enzyme that comes in the little Lactaid is lactase enzyme that people are lacking. It can be transient, like we just mentioned with chemo. It can also be genetic, right? So if you're from certain heritages, if you're from certain continents, your people, you're more likely to have a genetic trait that results in you not making lactase because your ancestors didn't drink milk.
And just age in itself, just as you get older, you just naturally start producing less because adults really they don't need, like adults really don't need to drink milk, is what I'm saying.
To survive. Cheese
is a whole nother story.
Nice.
You need the cheese.
All right. So if that's lactose intolerance, that's the intolerance to the carbohydrate, the sugar. The lactose is a sugar in milk. Some people cannot tolerate, and those are lactose intolerant people. That's totally separate from the sensitivity.
Or the allergy. Yeah.
or the
Yeah.
allergy. So there's many ways of reacting to dairy. Wait, you and I should probably do full disclosure here. Do you eat dairy?
Yeah. I eat cheese and
Okay.
yogurt. Yeah. I do not drink milk. But we know why. Go back to some previous episode where I told my story about why I do not drink milk.
Yes.
So when I was a kid in Spain, I just didn't want to tell the story again.
Okay.
The warm milk with the sugar cube.
Yeah, it sounds disgusting.
Yeah, disgusting. So yeah, I do not drink milk.
Okay.
I drink like milk with a Y, but I don't even drink that. I think it's weird. Milk is like a vehicle for things. It's a vehicle for cereal, and you could make a latte with it or something.
Yes, and I do also drink dairy.
You drink?
No, well, I put half and half in my coffee.
Oh,
And then I do cheese and I do yogurt. But I don't
okay.
drink milk. You're right. It's not something that would occur to me. It's also a lot of calories that I would never just use in a glass of milk. I'd rather be doing cheese if I'm going to do that many calories.
See, I know it's hard to talk down on cheese when you eat cheese, when you love cheese.
Right. So that's why I said full disclosure.
Yeah, no,
Every,
absolutely.
every person comes with biases. And so we got to throw that out there. So people are like, are these vegans?
Are these those crazy vegans talking their propaganda about dairy? No, not at all.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. If you're vegan, please proceed.
No, we're not being down on vegans in any way, but we both love our cheese. And I was going to say something. I don't remember what it was.
Sorry.
Okay. What was I going to say? It was something about cheese. I don't know.
So we talked about the carbohydrate aspect. The lactose,
right?
The main sugar in there, which is a carbohydrate. We can move on to the protein aspect of the milk,
and that is where the allergy comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. So allergies generally, the immune system can mount an antibody to proteins from the milk, and that's usually casein or whey. And this is where people have overt allergies like actual skin rashes, eczema. That's a common allergy. So for some people who have eczema, just removing dairy for a little while, got to give it at least a month. And I have to tell people this, when you're dealing with a reaction to a protein, when you're talking about an immune reaction, you have to give it more than just a week, because what you're waiting for is the antibodies that you've already made that are circulating in your bloodstream to fall apart. They enter a system in your body, and antibodies eventually all fall apart. Technically, it takes about 3 months to really get them all out, but usually people see a difference in about a month if you're talking about their skin. So you make different types of antibodies, and the one that causes the rash is called IgE, as in Edward. And it's easy to test, but really, it's cheaper just to remove the dairy product for a month and see what happens if you have a eczema. That's the first one I think of, because it's obvious and it's easy, and why not try that?
Well, that's kind of like one of the very few things I remember about my pediatrics class was when I was in school was for kids who have chronic ear infections. Just stop the dairy.
Yes.
And see what happens.
Amazing.
I mean, kids go through, getting tubes put in their ears and all of this. And it's like, if you just cut out the dairy and see, did that make a difference? So
I think that works over half of the time. Like, I think that over 50% of the time. I mean, when you're a clinician, you often think in terms of that, like what's going to be the most reliable and simplest thing to do out of the gates. And so we're always playing with these odds ratios in our head. And I would even put that at 70 to 80% of the time that works, just taking dairy out for these little kids with chronic ear infections.
And it's simple for us to say as clinicians, but when you present that to a parent who that's what the kid drinks all the time, that's what they live on, kind of thing, it's really not always an easy thing to take out of their diet. And I see that with, my patients as well. I live in a very dairy forward part of the country. Which is great for us cheese lovers. Okay. There's some really good cheese out here. But yeah, I remember we ask our dietitians for calcium intakes, and they pretty much just look at dairy, and some people consume a heck of a lot of dairy out here.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's kind of hard. And I've had conversations back when I was a resident, talking to patients about dairy, and then they're like, oh, I'm a dairy farmer. And you're like, oh, we'll cut back on it anyways.
It's a tougher thing to do, to make dietary changes against the dominant culture. If you're in, the part of the country where they're milking cows and everybody's a dairy farmer and everyone's eating cheese and drinking milk and fermenting and enjoying it. The question is it worth it or not? My take on that is always people are adults and they can make the decision. Is it worth your time and effort or not? You only know that once you take it out completely and then see how you do if you have symptoms that you want to know. So I'm not a huge tester. Just on that note, I just like take it out for a month, see how you feel. Do you wake up and you suddenly don't have to blow your nose every morning because you have less mucus congestion? Or, even if you live in Dairyland, USA, your health is worth it, I think. And if you're a listener, I think you probably lean that way too.
Yeah, and by presenting it for just stopping it for holding it for a month, you're not saying cut it out altogether. The person will make their decision based on how they feel. And, nowadays there are a lot of options for dairy alternatives, which, if patients are like, I no longer am tolerating this product, that's
Right.
milk, you can have different options to talk to them about. And it's kind of like depends on what their needs are as to like what you would recommend. Like if somebody's really trying to gain a lot of weight and they're not doing animal milk product, then you can maybe do like the canned coconut milk, super high fat. You're going to get a lot of calories in there. Soy milk has a great amount of protein,
Yes. I'm going to put a caveat on these that your best bet when you're buying an alternative milk, if you must buy an alternative milk, is to make sure there's not many things on that ingredient list.
Especially if you have a lot of GI issues to start, you want to make sure there's not a lot of like random weirdness in there. There often are fortified with vitamins. They'll be fortified with, vitamin D, or some of them have B vitamins in them. So, but yeah, just make sure that it's not a huge list. Make sure that it's whatever the product is, oats or whatever. Oats is another good caloric one. Peas are high in protein too. Pea milk. Like PEA.
Pea milk.
PEA milk.
I know. It's like, that sounds disgusting. But, okay.
Like peas.
I've never seen pea milk.
I have. I don't remember where. Yeah. Maybe Whole Foods or something.
I think the term milk is misleading with all these things, though.
Well,
I will say they really should just put the word
extract.
beverage. Yeah, they should do something else. It's not milky.
With coconut milk, the coconut milk beverage is the stuff you buy in a box or in like the carton. And then coconut milk is the stuff you get in the can that's actually like straight out of the coconut. Beverage has had something done to it to make it so it's not separated. But yeah, even on the cheese front, there are other options, which aren't necessarily good for you. I think I've seen some recipes recently for like fermented cashew cheese-like spread that is very few ingredients, and I've been wanting to try it. Because it is a fermented cashew product, so it,
Yeah, this is where we insert the real food. You want real food. I mean, ideally.
Yeah, because some of those alternative dairy products they're just oil.
They're just gross. Yeah, if it's processed food, it's processed food, and just try not to do that too often, or not at all if you can help it. Yeah, processed food is processed food, even if it has organic on the label.
Yeah, even though it's in the health food section.
Yeah. So can I insert here? This is a nice point with these proteins. We're still I'm going to circle us back to proteins. The casein in the whey that people do mount an actual immune response to. The IgE reaction might be obvious because it's an overt allergy, like a rash. The IgG reaction is a sneaky one, and it just can increase inflammation in the body, systemic inflammation. So wherever someone might have inflammation, that's where they would notice it. And so I use something like osteoarthritis, which is garden variety arthritis of aging, as a barometer of how much inflammation is in someone's body. So IgG is a slow set in 24 hours, 48 hours, even up to 72 hours before you react to foods that create an IgG reaction, which is separate from that immediate reaction of IgE. And these are two different types of antibodies. I should clarify. Ig stands for immunoglobulin, which is just a fancy term for antibody. So immunoglobulin means antibody. Anyways, back to the IgG. You really don't know that it's happening in real time. You don't have a dairy product and then ache, or have a dairy product and then have mucus right away. Generally speaking, it'll take a day to 3 days to set in. So you have to remove that for a longer term. And the New York Times just had a piece on food sensitivities, and this would be considered what we would call to someone a food sensitivity, where they have a reaction to the food and they're sensitive to it, but it's not a classic allergy, as in rash, anaphylaxis, whatever. So food sensitivities, it was a kind of a hit piece in the New York Times a few days ago. We'll link to it in the notes. But definitely had a lot of comments back where the readership said, yeah, well, you can say all you want about the science, but I took it out, I feel better. I took it out, I don't have these symptoms. Whatever the experimentation was with the elimination of dairy and then challenging it by bringing it back in the diet, and people resume symptoms. So yeah, we'll link to that New York Times piece because it was very interesting, very negative on the whole idea of food sensitivities, which I think, that's the classic trying to fit the art of medicine and the soft science into a hard science box, and it's not going to work. It's just not going to happen. So I guess we can talk about the rest of the ways one can be sensitive to it and how dairy relates to cancer. And that is what we're here for.
Yeah, we're here to talk about what is the association, if any, between dairy and cancer.
Right. Well, okay, so peripherally, systemic inflammation has to do with cancer.
Well, it's I don't know.
I know. We try to take down systemic inflammation.
I don't want it to be that, I have a sensitivity to dairy, therefore that's why I got my cancer. It's more nuanced than that, if there is a relationship at all. Okay, we're going to cut to a break, but before we do, these studies are epidemiological.
Ooh, it just rolled off your tongue.
There was a pause because I wasn't able to say that off air previously, but they're population studies. And so those kinds of studies cannot be taken as gospel, I suppose, because there's so many different nuances involved in how people live and how people eat. And they do try to do calculations to account for these different differences. But at the same time, yeah. Anyways, well, let's cut to a break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about what one of the possibilities is that might link dairy with cancer, and then we'll kind of talk about I don't know, whatever else comes to mind.
All right, let's do that. All right, so we talked a little bit about the protein and people being sensitive to that. We talked a little bit about the carbohydrate, lactose, and that being a very clear intolerance for some people. Fatty acids, that's the last macronutrient that's left, is the fats in the milk. So what do we know about that?
Well, there's saturated fats, which from animal products are not necessarily a great thing. And then there also is conjugated linoleic acid, CLA, which is an omega-6. And I have had people ask me about that with relation to weight loss. Because apparently there is a product that's marketed that helps with weight loss. But that is, I know people think about omega-6 and they're really down on them, but it's not a bad thing. CLA is not necessarily a bad thing in your diet.
Yeah. Well, and omega-6s do get a bad rap because of processed food using a whole lot of corn or soybean or whatever. These vegetable oils tend to be high in omega-6, so our ratio is way off, right? Omega-6 to omega-3. So I think that's why they get a bad rap, but omega-6 technically is also an essential fatty acid.
Right.
We have to eat them. We just eat too much of them and not enough of the omega-3s, and we throw everything off that way. We being Western diet people. That's what I mean by we, not me personally.
Not the royal we here. Well, no, the royal we. We as a nation.
We as a nation eat too much processed food. And it's one of the reasons we think processed food, one of the many reasons processed food is linked to higher cancer incidence. So that is definitely in those population studies right now. People who eat more processed food have more cancer of various types. I won't even list the arm length list of different cancers that processed food is linked to.
And probably also lack of nutrients that are in there, right? I mean,
well, that's what processing is about. Yeah.
Well, you take out the nutrients and then you put some in. Okay, but we don't want to go off on a whole nother tangent here.
No, but we will say that processing food is to give it a longer shelf life, which means nothing can live on it, which means you can't live on it either.
Which is why I was thinking that in Mongolia they were fermenting the milk so that it would have a longer shelf life.
Absolutely, that's what fermentation is always about.
But I thought that was kind of cool.
That's why fermentation and culturing exists. Yes.
I know, but it's just Like, how come more people didn't ferment their milk? I guess they did, right? They made yogurt or, different cheeses or whatnot. But
Hmm.
no, I just like it's just one of those like moments that clicked because I don't think of like I guess kefir and all of that as fermented milk, but it just was like, well, yeah, if you're living out in the middle of nowhere and really no way of keeping your food, let's just ferment it instead of drinking it straight out of the egg.
Yeah, right. Either raw right then that day, or you have to do something like ferment it. It's one of the reasons when I talk about heritage diets with people, I'm like, if you can go all the way back to pre-refrigeration, that's what you're actually looking towards. You really want to go a ways back, many generations if you possibly can, to see how they preserve the food, because that's probably the foods you should be most in line with biologically. All right, we digress again. So,
Yeah. It's a dairy digression. And so something else, going back to our whole lactose conversation, cream actually has less lactose. Cream and butter are lower in lactose.
that makes sense.
And yeah, the aged cheeses like Parmesan cheese, I think is like one of the most tolerated, as long as someone doesn't have reactions to like histamines, which is a whole nother story.
Oh my gosh, we naturopaths, we complicate this so much, right? Like,
I know. But, for somebody who's lactose intolerant, Parmesan might be the thing. And I used to think that mozzarella was like higher. Mozzarella?
mozzarella?
That's not a New Yorker talking. I used to think it was really high in lactose just because I personally do not tolerate it, but apparently it's not. It's actually very low in lactose. Okay, so cancer. We're here to talk about dairy and cancer and like what is the deal. So I think the big thing for people to know about is something called IGF-1.
Insulin like growth factor 1.
Yes. And so that is something that's found in animal proteins and has been implicated when there's an increased amount of circulating IGF-1. It's been implicated in carcinogenesis.
Yeah. A good friend of mine, Jacob Shore, did a lecture on IGF-1 years ago to a bunch of naturopaths. We have a national association that has an annual meeting. In any case, he went through this whole population who genetically are predisposed to not make. They actually, literally, they just don't make much IGF-1 at all. And they are very short because IGF-1 leads to more stature.
Because it's
It's a growth factor.
Yeah, it's a growth factor. That's what I meant. I knew. It's in the name.
I knew that.
My words.
In any case, it's fascinating because there is this population, I believe it was in South America, where genetically they don't make it and they're shorter and they have a lot less cancer. On the flip side, we think that high amounts of IGF-1 has to do with the data that we do see where people who are very tall do have more. I know colorectal cancer is higher in those folks.
I think prostate cancer is as well.
Prostate too.
Because I remember seeing that as a risk factor. I'm like, that is interesting.
It's assumed, that connection, that it might have to do with the IGF-1 throughout their life. We don't know that for a fact, but it's because it's population-based studies, right? So you're watching populations, you're really surmising things. You're not proving them. You're not really scientifically validating anything. You're just observing and making connections and correlations. So the classic saying is correlation does not mean causation, right? So we just have to be careful with extrapolating cause from something that's just associated.
Well, when I was going through treatment, and I have talked about it numerous times, including in our fasting episode, and my oncologist at the time was doing a study on fasting around chemo. One of the things that they were measuring was IGF-1.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, there is information out there, but does that directly tie dairy to causing cancer?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it might depend on the person's cancer, not just the type, but the subtype, right?
Right. And so the types of cancer that there's been some possible population study showing maybe there's a correlation are gastric, prostate, ovarian, and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Breast, it goes back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's not necessarily like dairy across the board. Like with breast, it was that there was a study showing that milk increased the risk, but then yogurt and cheese decreased the risk.
And this was a observational study of a
Yeah, these are,
population.
I mean, it's not like they're going to stick people in a lab and then have them only eat these foods. I mean, it's just, we just don't do studies like that.
My visual went straight to like sticking people in a lab and having like a running wheel and the whole bit, like but only with people.
That'd be kind of fun.
um, so one of the things with breast cancer specifically that I remember is, this is weird, but IGF-1 can directly bind to the estrogen receptor and stimulate it. So IGF-1 is something that has been shown with certain breast cancers, specifically estrogen receptor positive breast cancers. It does look like IGF-1 is implicated in spurring the growth a little bit like an estrogen molecule can. And this becomes most important for women who are on aromatase inhibitors, who otherwise have very, very low estrogen. Those aromatase inhibitors pretty much tank estrogen production. So anything that can stimulate the estrogen receptor in those people is of concern. So I would say those are the people I'm so careful with as far as blood sugar control, because IGF-1 tends to go up. It's insulin-like growth factor, and it does tend to follow insulin. It tends to follow people with high glucose levels will have higher IGF-1 often. Besides people who eat it, if you ingest IGF-1 from milk or from meat or whatever, not to make people paranoid, but just to make people more aware of the reason there are so many nuances in the data is that's a very specific subset of a population where I would be more aggressive about controlling IGF-1 ingestion, just because there's data showing that it can directly stimulate the estrogen receptor.
So definitely controlling blood sugar, which I talk to the majority of my patients about in general. And then in that population, you would advise them to really limit their dairy consumption, it sounds like.
I would. Yeah, I would in that subpopulation. And what I tend to do is trying to update when I'm seeing a patient. I tend to go back to the research and update it and say, is there any reason? I happen to know that one. There might be other cancers this is relevant for that have various receptors, but IGF-1 is pretty clear. I mean, that's not a mystery. We already know that it can bind to the estrogen receptor. I always assume cancer is smart. That's just one of my assumptions. People who have existing cancer especially, is that it has its own little survival mechanism, is how I think of it. It's like those cells want to survive. And if their only possibility is to figure out how to bind to IGF-1, they're going to figure it out over time. So this is why it's a wily opponent, cancer, because it does have some kind of, in my mind, biological survival instinct. Scary, but true.
It's stupid. Cancer is stupid, but it's
Yeah.
smart.
Yeah. Stupid cancer.
Yeah. So with prostate cancer, I think that was probably one of the most recent articles that popped up in my email, was talking about prostate cancer, but it was more emphasizing the importance of a plant-based diet.
Mm-hmm.
And then in a plant-based diet, you're going to naturally have less dairy products.
Yeah.
So from what I was reading, there was nothing that pointed its finger directly at dairy. It was more just emphasizing the importance of plants.
That makes sense. Well, and for prostate cancer, it does look like there are certain byproducts of dairy and meat that might be particularly bad. They're called putrescines.
That sounds delicious.
Isn't it? It's exactly what it sounds like. They are kind of gnarly smelling. They're putrid. But in our bodies, we make them from the meats. We create putrescines, and it's a kind of a part of some of our cycles. Methionine is the top of the cycle. That's that methionine homocysteine cycle. So this gets pretty deep, and we can talk biochemistry in another venue. But every cancer is different. Every metabolic process in the subtype of the cancer is different. And so I bet dairy is harmful for some and not for others. The God's honest truth is taking it out is not going to be harmful as long as you get your requisite proteins, carbohydrates, and fats in your day. So yeah, this might be why vegan diets, when you're dealing with cancer, especially active cancer, leaning towards that, making animal products the exception, not the rule, makes a heck of a lot more sense. And if you can live vegan, great. If you can get all your nutrients in, and you must be a mindful vegan. You can't just say, I'm going to cut off all animal products and go on your merry way. You have to make sure that you make a concerted effort to get your requisite protein, carbs, fats, and nutrients in every day. That's all.
So is the effect of dairy, is it something, like let's say for colorectal cancer, right? Dairy has been shown to be more protective, but is it the dairy or is it the calcium? And I think that's one thing is that people, when I ask patients, and I don't expect them to know all the foods that have calcium, but like, I'm like, oh, do you eat a calcium rich diet? In my mind, I'm thinking like dark leafy green vegetables and nuts and things like that. And they're like, oh, no, I don't really eat a lot of dairy, or yeah, I eat a lot of dairy. And so it's like, I think that's really separating. Like,
Yeah.
is calcium protective or is it something else in the dairy? And I guess that would be the same with, these different cancers that potentially, possibly may, be influenced by dairy consumption. Like what part of the dairy is it? Is it something that is affecting the hormone levels, whether, in a hormone positive type cancer like breast or prostate? Or is there something else that's going on?
Right. Right. I know with the colorectal cancer, I would assume any calcium source would be protective of colorectal cancer incidence. So we have really good data, and it's the World Health Organization has put this out where they have found that calcium all around, people who consume more calcium have lower risk of their first diagnosis of colorectal cancer. I think this is because calcium binds some of the bile salts in the gut, in the colon, and there are some toxic compounds made from some of the bile salts that are implicated in colorectal cancer. So the bile goes down the gut, and long story short, metabolically becomes a carcinogen in the colon, and that is implicated in the incidence of colorectal cancer. But if calcium is around, calcium binds that salt, and it renders it impossible to make that carcinogen. So they think that this might be one of the reasons that calcium intake in any form, and that includes calcium as a supplement, in any form can be protective of colorectal cancer incidence. That's what I've read. I've read a lot about colorectal cancer, probably more than other cancers. There's a few cancers that I've probably gone more than knee deep, probably neck deep in researching.
Well, I think, kind of going back to like the whole growth factor part of dairy, I think we need to mention something that, you'll often see on a package of cheese or on some sort of dairy product. It'll say does not contain or was not raised with RBGH or RBST, and that's recombinant bovine growth hormone or recombinant bovine somatotrophin. And so that is something that is, if you're listening in another country, I know in Canada and Europe, those aren't used. In this country, it is used to increase milk production. And it potentially can increase, because it is a growth hormone, it could potentially increase IGF-1. And then one of the things it can also increase is like health problems in the cows, and that may contribute to them getting like mastitis. And so that would mean that they would get more antibiotics. And then is there something in that itself that might be creating something harmful? And it's easy to find these days. And, it's kind of up to you if that is a concern.
Mm-hmm.
But there are plenty of products that are organic or not organic that are using milk that does not have this added hormone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if someone is so lucky as to be able to get grass-fed, grass-finished, cleanly sourced milk from a neighbor down the road or the co-op or the buying group, I know there's buying groups that can get around some of the state laws that require pasteurization to put it on the shelf. At least in Oregon, you have to have it pasteurized to put it on a shelf in a store. It must be pasteurized. But some of that raw milk is pretty cool stuff. I mean, if you can get it cleanly sourced, it must be done responsibly.
Yeah, I don't encourage my patients going through active treatment to do anything like that.
Oh no, not during active treatment. But during active treatment, you shouldn't be doing anything that's even remotely smacks of something that could be infectious. So you should be washing your raw fruits differently too. I mean, during treatment, I totally agree. But after treatment, I mean, raw milk is kind of a perfect, if you're going to do milk and you have access to it, you just have to make sure it's done responsibly. Don't buy it from some
out of the back of a trunk.
Unknown person. Yeah. If it's a wayside truck that just opened up their gate and said raw milk, don't do that. Maybe maybe make it a little better source. But that's what our great grandparents, like if you do have ancestors that ate milk, they had raw milk a lot. There's nothing wrong with that as long as it's done well. And you can make buttermilk from that very easily on your counter. And, it's pretty cool because it ferments itself. You're looking at me like I wouldn't do it.
No, you know what? I tried buttermilk not too long ago, and it was actually really tasty. But yeah, I don't know, because I wouldn't drink milk no matter what.
Have you ever? But you can, from raw milk, you can make your own soft cheese.
I have made cheese. But not from cow milk, from goat milk. I have made soft cheese using milk straight out of the goat.
Yeah.
And of course you heat it up. I mean, you heat it up for a long period of time and, you add your lemon juice. But yeah, I remember when I learned how to make cheese, I felt like I had some sort of superpower.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was just super simple. It was goat's milk and lemon.
Mm-hmm.
And then you add the little spices and herbs at the end. But no, it was delicious.
Yeah. Yeah. And the truth is, milk doesn't spoil. It only spoils because we've pasteurized it and now we have weird things growing in it and it gets sour and nasty. But raw milk becomes buttermilk.
Well, it does. That's how it spoils. It spoils by fermenting.
Right. Right. It's not spoiled. It's fermented. It's spoiled when it's an undesirable organism. It's fermented when it's desirable. Either way, something's growing. But what I'm saying is, if you do it from raw milk, it's a desirable fermentation product. It's the nasty stuff we get at the store that spoils.
But isn't that the whole point of pasteurization, is to prevent it from spoiling?
Is it?
Are we putting our conspiracy hats on now?
Wait, I got to get my aluminum hat. Just a second.
Okay. Wait, no, we got to kind of let's summarize here, because I think people
let's do it.
Just like, what the heck is this episode? They're like, I really wanted to know the facts about dairy and cancer, and there's really nothing that is definitive.
No, I can't say there's anything definitive. I will say that it's like everything else we do as adults. There's risk and then there's benefit. And you have to weigh your risk and benefit for yourself. There's no black and white to this at all, because there's really no way to say it always does good or it always does bad. It's not possible. We are too biochemically different. Every individual is different. And then if someone's had a cancer diagnosis, now every cancer is different. So you've got a hugely complex array of variables that you cannot possibly put a yes or no answer on. Now, I will caveat that with people who believe that it's non-ethical to milk a cow will be absolute no, right? Like they're like, it's not fair to the cow. We shouldn't be taking their milk. There is a subset of people who believe that, and that's fine. I mean, everyone has their ethical standards, and I can respect that. But other than, ethical reasons, I can't think of any must do or can't do that we can say uniformly across the board for every person.
I do want to point out, because I always found this really interesting, I often refer to the Harvard website, like their public health, for people who want to get some information on nutrition. You can also look at AICR, which stands for American Institute for Cancer Research.
Yeah, that's it.
My God, the brain just left the body. But what I find really interesting about Harvard, like they have their own healthy eating plate. And unlike the one that's produced by the FDA that a lot of schools go by, it doesn't include dairy on their plate. Mm. They do list later down with like sodas and juices and dairy. They're like, limit to 1 to 2 servings a day. But I just think that's really interesting that putting my tinfoil hat on as to the reasons as to why dairy has really been pushed, especially in our culture.
I will vouch for that. Yes.
Yeah.
It gets pushed at the dietitian conferences.
Well, I mean, it gets pushed at schools and in commercials and those kinds of things and, advertising. So when patients ask me, does dairy increase my risk of cancer? I still say no, because we don't know. If somebody says that they are, taking in 4,000 milligrams, well, we calculate and they're doing 4,000 milligrams of calcium, and that's from dairy products alone, I advise that person to cut back.
Right.
more because I want diversity in their diet. But yeah, I don't think that this is something where we can, cut or dry, Hmm? Where we can say one way or the other. What I did find interesting is I started to approach other people who are experts in their field about what is in, let's say like Chinese medicine, like what is there a benefit to having dairy? Is there a risk to having dairy? And kind of like what you're saying is like it depends on the individual. So in Chinese medicine, the perspective is completely different. They look at, like deficiencies or excess of qi, for example. And so somebody who is yin deficient, dairy might actually be beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because it can be very nourishing. So, it kind of depends on, and I'm sure it's the same like in Ayurveda, like depending on what the person's dosha is, what their constitution is whether or not dairy would be appropriate for them. And it may just be like at that moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like, oh yeah, it's good for you at all times. Like I know in Ayurveda, it's very seasonal as to when certain doshas do better or worse with dairy products. So, even in traditional medicines, there's no absolute
Right.
answer. That's kind of what I'm putting out for people who are like really, completely holistic minded. There's no definite answer in the science or in the traditional medicine.
So if a listener is seeing someone who does some of these traditional medicines, whether it's Eastern Asian medicine or anything, you can ask that practitioner what their opinion is on dairy for you, given your constitution and what they see.
And I think the really important question to ask is to ask that practitioner, do you take in dairy?
Yes, it definitely biases.
It really does.
I know. It's true.
Yeah. So I think that's the most important question.
That's the nature of all healthcare, though, too. I mean, your doctor, whoever you're getting advice from, we're all colored by our experience. And so no way around that.
Is there anything else? I'm sure we've left out a ton.
Well, if we left out a ton, then maybe our listeners can let us know what we didn't answer, and we can either answer it on social media, or you can always email us, or we'll do a second part. If we get enough questions, we'll just be like, part 2 dairy. Here's all the things we should have said.
Here's all the stuff that we meant to say. But we're going to have a bunch of links, especially to that article that I mentioned about why humans have evolved to drink milk, because I think it's really interesting. I thought the history of food and like how people came to eat what they eat is so interesting to me. So yeah, we're definitely sharing that article and some other ones. So check out our show notes. And if you like what you hear, remember to support us by either sharing this episode or dropping us a couple of coins over at Buy Me a Coffee.
Yeah, and there's a direct link in our episode notes as well, where they can just click on that and it goes straight to our host.
And everywhere you can just find us by searching for The Cancer Pod. It's pretty easy to find us on social media or Buy Me a Coffee or wherever we do roam.
Or the podcasts roam.
Or the podcasts roam. I like that.
Yeah.
So on that note, I'm Dr. Leah Sherman.
And I'm Dr. Tina Kaiser.
And this is The Cancer Pod.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to The Cancer Pod. Remember to subscribe, review, and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media for updates. And as always, this is not medical advice. These are our opinions. Talk to your doctor before changing anything related to your treatment plan. The Cancer Pod is hosted by me, Dr. Leah Sherman, and by Dr. Tina Kaiser. Music is by Kevin MacLeod. See you next time.
Holy cow.